What's going on? I wanted to make a video kind of talking about the Great Migration and touching on things that are going on today and how they correlate to the past, and how there's really nothing new under the sun. And the Great Migration happened around, I think it was around 1916 to 1970. So the Great Migration was a relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from rural South to cities of the North, Midwest, and West from about 1916 to 1970, driven from their homes by unsatisfactory economic opportunities and harsh segregationist laws. Many blacks headed north, where they where they took advantage of the need for industrial workers. What arose during the First World War, during the Great Migration, African Americans began to build a new life, build a new place for themselves in public life, actively confronting racial prejudice as well as economic, political, and social changes to create black urban culture that would exert enormous influence in the decades to come. So, what caused the Great Migration? After the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, white supremacy was largely restored across the South in the 1870s, and segregationist policies known as Jim Crow soon became the law of the land. Southern blacks were forced to make their living working the land due to black codes. Now, we're going to go into black codes. And it's going to tell you that all this stuff, this so-called Black Lives Matter and all this other stuff is this. It's just a script. Okay, all of this shit is just propaganda, just being spread again, and they're just rehashing and regurgitating history. So the black codes we've already went over the black codes, but I'll go over it again. The black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans. Remember, I told you African American is fake. It is a social construct. It is a stateless person. These people, African Americans, have no rights. They have no legal standing. They don't have no judicial standi, because you cannot be native to two continents. And ensure their availability as cheap labor force after slavery was abolished during the Civil War. Through the Union victory had given, though the Union victory had given, wait, where was that? I'm sorry, I'm reading this off this little bitty iPhone. Though the Union victory had given some 4 million slaves their freedom, the question of freed black status. Remember, freed black status. Everything is about status. Nothing is about race. So when you see all this Black Lives Matter, the NBA is going to kill itself. You see what I'm saying? All this shit is going to kill itself with this so-called Black Lives Matter bullshit, because so-called white people are going to be like, man, I ain't watching that bullshit. Okay, so 4 million slaves, free black status, I'm sorry. In the post-war South was still very much unresolved. Under the black codes, many states require blacks to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refuse, they risk being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor, meaning prison, jail. Outrage over black codes helped undetermined support for the President Andrew Johnson and the Republican Party. See? It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Like, the Democratic Party is losing a lot of so-called black voters because of the bullshit they're pulling, and then people are running over to the Republicans. It's the same bullshit. Democrat, Republican is the same mofos. They the same people, man. You running from your father to get to your mother, basically. You running from the person who beat you to go to another person that's going to beat you and enslave you. It's the same shit. So the Reconstruction begins when President Abraham Lincoln announced the impending passage of the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863. The stakes of the Civil War shifted dramatically. Okay, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the so-called slaves. It did not free. It just said the federal government had the right to dictate who could practice slavery. Okay, so in the early stages of the Civil War, a Union victory would mean no less than a revolution in the South, where a particular institution of slavery had dominated economic, political, and social life in the antebellum years. In April 1865, as the war drew to a close, Lincoln shocked many, proposing limited suffrage for African Americans in the South. He was assassinated days later. However, his successor, Andrew Johnson, would be the one to preside over the beginning of the Reconstruction. Okay, so this kind of gives you a footnote. Did you know in the years following the Reconstruction the South reestablished many of the provisions of the black codes in the form of so-called Jim Crow laws? These remained firmly in place for almost a century, but were finally abolished with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 1964. Johnson, a former senator from Tennessee who remained loyal to the Union during the war, was the firm supporter of states' rights. And remember, a state is an East state. A state is nothing more than a fucking plantation. I'm just keeping it 100 with you. So when they say they're in form of states' rights, they're always going to say states. Just like I told you, the Civil War was not North versus South. It was the states versus the Union. It was the states versus federal. Okay? And believe the federal government had no say in issues such as voting requirements at the state level. Now, don't you see currently, you see Donald Trump and a lot of the so-called Democrats are going head on about mail-in ballots. See what I'm saying? All of this shit is there, dude. There ain't nothing new under the sun. If you want to see what's going to happen in the future, you have to review what happened in the past. Under the Reconstruction policies, which began May 1865, the former Confederate states were required to uphold the abolition of slavery, made official by the 13th Amendment. Now, if somebody tells me the 13th Amendment abolished slavery again, I'm going to smack the hell out of them. Because the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. It abolished slavery. It perfected slavery. So what it did is it made slavery illegal except for a crime. So what did the states do? They made everything illegal. That's why when people use phrases like so-and-so is a criminal. Well, did they harm anybody? No. Well, then they're not a fucking criminal. You see what I'm saying? A crime, the states make everything fucking illegal. And then that's how they can get you into the 13th and 14th Amendment. Remember, an amendment is just an addendum. So it's just an addendum to the original Constitution. So let's see. 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Swear loyalty to the Union and pay off the war debt. Beyond the limitations, the states and their ruling classes, just like I said voting is the act for slaves because it's the people who have formed super PACs. They're the ruling classes. Rich people don't vote. They just send these dumbasses out here to fucking vote. They send the slaves out to vote so they can have the illusion that they can actually pick their president when they can't. You can't pick a president when you're a slave. If you're a United States citizen, you're under the same rules of Puerto Rico. That means that you cannot vote in a United States election. Sorry, you didn't know that? Now you do. Okay, so I'm sorry. Swear loyalty to the Union and pay off their war debt. Oh, shit. Damn it. Sorry. Swear to the Union and pay off their war debt. Beyond those limitations, the states and their ruling classes, traditionally dominated by white planters, were giving a relatively free hand in rebuilding their own governments. Passage of black codes. Even former slaves fought to assert their independence and to gain economic autonomy during the earliest years of the Reconstruction. White landowners acted to control the labor force through a system similar to the one that had existed during slavery. Oh yeah, y'all get ready for this shit. Y'all get ready for this shit for all y'all people who want to be employees and not start your own business. You gonna be, yeah, they gonna start giving y'all shittier and shittier jobs. To the end, in late 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enacted the first black codes. Mississippi law required blacks to have written evidence of employment for each for the coming year, January. If they left before the end of the contract, they will be forced to forfeit earlier wages and subject to arrest. Why you think they have parole? Why you think so many brothers is on parole? In South Carolina, a law prohibited blacks from holding any occupation other than farmer or servant unless they paid an annual tax of $10 to $100. This provision hit free blacks already living in Charleston and former artisans especially hard in both states. Blacks were given heavy penalties for vagrancy, including forced plantation labor in some cases. Limits on blacks' freedom. Remember, they're not saying this is so-called black people. This is the people of the so-called black status, because they're not just going to relegate this to so-called a skin color. Why would you relegate something to a skin color when you can put it on everybody? Okay, limits on blacks' freedom. Under Johnson's Reconstruction policies, nearly all Southern states would enact their own black codes. In 1865 through 1866, while the codes granted certain freedoms to African Americans, which is that hint word, but this is today. They would have said blacks in the past, including the right to buy and own property, marry, make contracts, and testify in court. Only cases involving their people of their own race. Their primary purpose was to restrict blacks' labor and activity. Some states limit the type of property that blacks could own, while virtually, what you have redlining. You see what I'm saying? So redlining, this is one of the reasons why so-called black folks' wealth was not, passed down traditionally. And this is why we have to change it. Being knowledgeable about finances and all that. Okay, so some states limited the type of property blacks could own, while virtually all former Confederate states passed strict vagrancy and labor contract laws, as well as so-called anti-enticement measures designed to punish anyone who offered higher wages to a black laborer already under a contract. Now, let me tell you why they do this. This is all for divide and conquer. This is what they're trying to say. This is affirmative action. Now, affirmative action did not go to so-called black people. It went to so-called white women, or it went to women in general. So what happened was, so-called, as usual, so-called black people get blamed for things. This is why they have Black Lives Matter and Antifa and all this shit, and they use code words like, well, these are Black Lives Matter rioters. No, they're not. They're paid anarchists. They have absolutely nothing to do with so-called black people, as I went through and told you that Black Lives Matter was a LGBTQ movement. Had nothing to do with so-called black people. So, unless you're so-called black and gay, then they care about you. Everybody else, they don't give a fuck about. So, let's see. So, this basically is telling you that they can arrest so-called black people, which are basically a class of people. This is poor whites, too, because I can get into so-called poor whites and how they were slaves too, but I'm not getting into all that. For some reason, this video only lets me put up 15 minutes, so I can't even go through all of this. But, this was passed by the political system in which blacks effectively had no vote. The black codes were enforced by all white police and state militia forces. Another thing, people do not understand, the 10th Amendment is not allowing the policing powers. It is in Article 1. The 10th Amendment makes clear of the policing powers. It does not give policing powers. Police are nothing more than commercial debt collection agents. That's all they are. I can go into how the rules of the road are really federal and not state, how they're bringing you into these courts that have no jurisdiction and fleecing people, giving them traffic tickets and using them as taxes because your status is incorrect. Okay? I'm gonna close this out and I'm out. Y'all have a good one.